And welcome to the floor, Stephen Nelson, for his concluding remarks. Stephen.
Thank you so much, Julia. I feel like Temi Odumosu could have done this for us. I want to, her talk was so rich, and I think strikes at so many of the issues and questions that we've been wrestling with today around photography and the whole ecosystem. If we learned nothing else today, we've learned that photography and African photography and all of the directions that our presenters have gone in presents to us an incredibly diverse and complex ecosystem of different ways of doing things and of different themes that come up. And as we were going through these presentations and as people were sharing their brilliance with us, I thought of the scholar Dylan Robinson, and he wrote a book called Hungry Listening. And in his introduction, he defines hungry listening as a way to name settler colonial forms of perception and pit it against indigenous forms of perception as well. But he also thinks about hungry listening as a kind of way to understand the reality of indigenous lives within this larger terrain. And as we went through today, I kind of started thinking about a notion of hungry looking. And, sort of thinking about that as a kind of intersection of colonial forms of knowledge production and perception, which to a greater or lesser degree, we are all stuck with. It's kind of this structure that we have in terms of institutions, in terms of the practices of research. And I think that Temi pointed to that really quite beautifully. And its intersection with, African realities of betweenness and African realities of interpreting this material as well, and living with the material and being in this material. And I think that what was so fascinating to me is to see how this kind of a mess, it's kind of a mess, plays out in photography, in the scholarship on photography, and in the very act of being in the world. And so what we've seen today are these demonstrations of ever-shifting positions and scholars and artists and writers who have really sort of deftly negotiated a lot of different positions. Within that too, we've seen everything from reinterpretation of photographs, and so a kind of reclamation of subjectivity. We've seen best practices in terms of creating relationships with collaborators on the continent for the maintenance of archives. And I think the Malian example is a beautiful example of that. We've seen the ways in which, and I think Temi mentioned this beautifully with the Digital Benin project, how the sort of digital reproduction of photographs can come into this whole larger terrain of the creation of heritage and what that means in 2022. Another big issue, I think, for me was privacy. And the three papers this afternoon by John Peffer, Giulia Paoletti, and Sandrine Collard, where they were talking about the ways in which we can know. There's this sort of, on the one hand, this urge to know, right? This urge to de-anonymize photography and de-anonymize the archive. And my question there was, when do we stop? And I think that John very effectively sort of showed us, that we don't need to see everything, right? That there is a point at which there are things that we don't, that are not ours, that are not meant for us, and that people don't want us to see. And I think that and using legal definitions to sort of get to that, I thought was a really, really wonderful way in. And then to see how that practice takes shape on the ground reminded me of what many of us did in the field anyway, you know, sort of thinking about permission. Were there generations where they didn't bother to do it? What did I do as a baby art historian? What do people do now? And that sort of very, very heady material. But Zoe and Julia asked me to sort of suggest directions, and I you know, it's tough because there are, you know, there are 1,000 directions, and I wondered, you know, where do we go? Where do we stop? Do we stop? What, you know, and I think about this in terms of decolonization, and I'm not even sure what I mean by that in this context. And to be honest with you, I'm thinking out loud, right? And you know, from changing relationships to rethinking what metadata could be. Because they're all married, they're all in the same ecosystem. What might relationships look like moving on, right? What do we have to lose? And this came across so strongly in some of the work. What do we have to lose? What do we have to let go of in order to keep going on? And I think what this suggests is, and I would suggest that part of that is our own sense, and I'm talking mostly to those of us who are working in the West, our own sense of the specialness of our expertise, that we might have to, and we've seen this in action, and we've seen people model this, that we have to start thinking about expertise differently, that we have ours as art historians, as people who know a thing or two about a thing or two, but also understanding that there are other forms of expertise at play, and that we have to be comfortable with the discomfort that someone may know something that we don't know. And you know, one could say, okay, we do that, we work in the field, but it's different. All right. And what I'm getting at, and I think what many of today's participants got at so beautifully, is that we're not in the field to extract information, right? We are in the field to start opening up work and lives, and, you know, and really understanding the full range of the work of the work, how to understand it across many different intersections and many different, on many different levels. And it's a different model for me because the easy thing to say was always, oh, we have placed another layer of meaning onto X. We've placed another layer of meaning onto Y. But then suddenly other layers ossify or don't change. And what I'm thinking of is something, and I have no answers, something more organic or something more collaborative, or something that is sort of laced with emotional justice, emotional care, humility, and generosity, and on the parts of all of us working. And I think of that finally in the ways of trying to affect structural change. And we tend to think of that in institutions, but I think of research as an institution. And I think Temi brought that up beautifully. It is an institution with its metadata, with all of its baggage. How can we start to change what that looks like? And once we do, you know, where might that take us? And in the interest of time, I'm going to stop there. But I do want to thank all of our organizers. I want to thank all of our participants, Zoe, Julia, everybody. This has been an amazing, amazing day. I've learned so much, and I'm honored to be here with all of you. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. For those of you in Africa, I hope you get some sleep. It's getting to 10 o'clock. And have a great weekend, everyone. And thank you for being with us today.